Hello, guys.
Hello.
Hi. Is Christian already on the call? I'm not sure if they have joined from our meeting room.
Hey, you're fun. All the Googlers are in a meeting room together.
Cool. Then we should ideally start, right?
Yeah, we got Christian, we got Hivda, we got me, Greg, and John.
Cool. Hello, guys.
Hivda.
Okay. So
Hi.
there are some items on the agenda. The first one, I think Quinton did put this week back, is about creating a SIG charter. So Paul and I had some discussions on this, and uh, we did intend to initiate writing a charter. Most of it, in our current suggestion, is that there are two major portions to this. One is defining the vision, mission, and the charter, and the second portion is defining roles and responsibilities for the SIG. So the first portion more or less seemed to be rewording of what already exists on the SIG page currently in community. Um the second portion, which is about defining the roles and responsibilities, I think we have them defined to some extent, but we probably need to formalize the same on the similar lines to other SIGs or the example that has been set by the steering committee. So I think we'll be taking this forward, and one PR is there. Uh, I or Paul will raise further PRs to take it forward. Is Paul there on the call already, or he's okay? I guess he's not there. So
I'm afraid Paul is away this week, so he can't join us.
Okay. If anybody else has any other suggestion about this, or what we should be doing about this, or want to pitch in, most welcome. Please go ahead and talk about it. Okay.
Sounds good, Irfan. One very brief suggestion was that rather than get stuck on this stuff, we have a bunch of people doing a bunch of things today, and we should just write those down and say these are the roles in the SIG. And then, you know, if we want to change that, or if people start doing different roles, we can, you know, amend it from there. But rather than going into a lengthy process of deciding who wants to do what in the future, etc., we should just say this is what we do today and write down the names and the roles and go forward from there. Just a suggestion.
I think that sounds great.
But effectively, how's that different from the README that we have? I mean, what's the charter supposed to represent in wording?
So I think oh, sorry, carry on, Irfan.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the charter has two major portions. One is about the mission statement, or what the SIG collectively is working towards, or what is the goal of the SIG, those kind of things. So those are already there on the README. I think they are well explained, and it's more or less just putting it at a different place, probably in a different charter.md or something like that. And there is a PR which Paul did already raise towards that. The second portion of that is defining the roles and responsibilities. So currently only the SIG leads are defined, or SIG leads are assigned. The steering committee example of the same thing suggests more roles. So probably, for example, they suggest there could be a lead who is managerial lead, a technical lead, that kind of stuff. Probably we don't need all those fine-grained roles. So as Quinton suggested, we can just list down, say, a bunch of 3-4 roles that people have as part of that charter.md itself. I think that should be good to go as of now.
Okay, thank you.
Um, yeah, second and more important point is about defining maybe not 1 year roadmap, at least 3 to 6 months roadmap for our SIG. And we had some discussion around this in last Federation work group meeting. So we sort of arrived at that. At that point, we did not have very clear definition of probably what we'll be doing 6 months down the line, but maybe have some definition of work items that we are currently doing and probably would be doing in next month or so. Maru suggested that probably we continue working something like this and we'll get more clarity down the line to define the clear goals for say 6 months, which are say sort of a little long term. That is where the Federation work group is. I think cluster registries goals are pretty well defined, and Cube MCI also might have defined goals, so which can be put up in I mean wherever they are supposed to be put.
Yeah, just one comment on that. I would strongly encourage us to write down a 1-year plan for each of these things. These plans can always change, but moving forward with no plan and saying we'll come up with a plan in the future doesn't seem like the right approach here.
I think that's reasonable. I just want to make sure that there's sort of an understanding that the plans like 6 months out are very tenuous, I think, just because there's a lot of unknowns as we sort of work through this problem. And so I just would like to make sure that that's communicated so that someone who's looking at this doesn't go, oh, I'm going to get this feature in a year. It's like, well, be pretty
I think that's
sure.
totally reasonable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
we can put some confidence interval or some kind of comment next to each item on the roadmap to give that level of detail. I agree. We don't want to promise things a year out and then change our minds in 6 months' time and cause people pain. But I think it's useful to sit down and think hard about, given what we know today, what we would like to work on for the next 12 months and write it down and publish it and say, to the best of our knowledge, this is what we plan to do for the next 12 months with confidence intervals accordingly.
And evolve
I have
like maybe.
Okay, go ahead, Maru. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead first.
I was just going to say, like, I think the other thing I'd like to see if we're going to start writing down plans is we just have regular check-ins. So it's like, you know, even if it was just once every quarter, it's like, okay, where are we going to go and actually evolve it rather than throw something in a spreadsheet or in a document and just kind of have it diverge from what we're doing. So that's my only request.
Absolutely agreed. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Google has a reasonably successful thing called OKRs, Objectives and Key Results, and they have annual ones and quarterly ones, and they typically check in on those around about quarterly. It depends on the team, etc. But I think, you know, unless anyone has a better proposal, it sounds like pretty much what you're describing. Set a 12-month plan and then have like every 3 month check-ins on that plan. And, you know, roundabout release, you know, either before or after the release or something seems like a good place to, you know, sync up and say, here's where we are on our plan. And perhaps, you know, extend the 12-month plan. You know, after 3 months, you only have 9 months of runway left. So maybe that's the right time to say, well, we're going to, you know, adjust the runway accordingly every 3 months.
Yeah, cool. I like that idea. I mean, mainly it's like I want it to be a useful thing and not just like something we have to do. And hopefully we evolve it, what works, what doesn't, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that triggered it was this announcement by the PM guys, but I think it, you know, irrespective of what they want and the fact that KubeCon's coming up, I think we have a very big gaping hole, which is that we don't have a medium to long-term plan written down anywhere, and that's not the right thing to be, not the right place to be. Okay, I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I was going to propose that we wait for, say, 2 more weeks and keep our goal as trying to put down something, whatever you suggested, Quinton and Maru, in a more concrete shape before the KubeCon. So I think we'll have some momentum by that time.
Yeah, we should just double check the deadlines. I think I think the PM guys are wanting, you know, some stuff written down by some date so they can put stuff together for KubeCon, and we shouldn't miss that by, you know, a few days for no good reason. So if we need to shorten it from 2 weeks to 1 week or whatever, we should do whatever we need to do to fit into that timeline. I don't remember what the proposed timeline was, but let's check it today.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is that KubeCon is fast approaching and we don't want to be left without a plan to talk about at KubeCon.
I guess there are two different things. One is what we basically need to talk at KubeCon and tell about our SIG and all that stuff. The other is that we have a plan somewhere, as Winton was suggesting, there is a template of OKR, that kind of stuff put up. So we actually had a backlog sheet, which had been a running sheet since almost 2 years, which completely got outdated. We can revive that if that kind of stuff is needed. But I mean, what I was saying is that when we are at presenting at KubeCon, I think that is when we would probably need that kind of stuff, a sheet like that, isn't it?
Well, there are multiple uses here. So I'm just looking through the email from SIG PM. They actually asked us to give them a roadmap by April 4th, which is last week, Wednesday or so. So we're overdue for that. Besides that, you know, many of us are going to be at KubeCon, and it would seem to make sense to get together and, you know, talk about stuff. And so doing that in the absence of a roadmap seems not like a good idea either. So I think we should, rather than, you know, spending 2 weeks putting a roadmap together, we should just do it this week and send it in. And hopefully that's not too late for PM, product management. And I can assist with that if anyone wants my help. I mean, so the three main sub-projects are MCI, cluster registry, and federation, right? There's nothing major other than those three. And MCI, if I understand correctly, has a sort of roadmap. I've certainly seen it referenced by Nikhil in the sense of what they plan to do in the future and support clouds other than Google, etc. Is there anyone here who's directly involved in the MCI project that can comment on how far away they are from having a 12-month plan?
So we have some ideas of what we're working on. It's kind of like we have some of our milestones. I'm not sure exactly how to scale on those, but I feel like we can just start talking about, we know we'll do the controller point, and that's kind of the main milestone. I guess the, you know, the alpha beta GA hopes of that.
Yeah, and to be clear, depending on the size of the project, I mean, MCI is a reasonably small project, I believe. I'm not sure how many active contributors there are, but I gather that it's only a small number. You know, they have 3 or 4 bullet points saying this is what these, you know, 1 or 2 people plan to do in the next 12 months is totally reasonable. It's certainly better than nothing.
Yeah.
And then the other one is obviously cluster registry. And Jonathan, you seem to indicate that you already had something approaching 12-month roadmap there.
Yeah, I don't know if we would necessarily call it a 12-month roadmap, because given the scope of the project, I don't expect it to be 12 more months of development work. So I think that the 12-month roadmap for the cluster registry, if something like that were to exist, would be more of an ecosystem map, which would describe what we expect to build up around the cluster registry.
That makes perfect sense, yeah. You know, stabilized GA and basically not much more required other than integration assistance. That's a roadmap.
Excellent. Cool.
So yeah, and the federation stuff similarly. I think we have you know, most of the meat there. We just need to format it into something that is consumable as a roadmap, perhaps with some release targets on each item. So I can certainly team up with whoever else is interested and get that out by the end of the week. So
how about this? we have some priority items with Huawei's perspective in view. So we put that out. And Maru or Paul, you can put out whatever is Red Hat's priority perspective towards Federation V2 or whatever you want to call it. And we can merge the both, maybe reassign the priorities, and that might be our at least midterm, short, long-term plan kind of stuff. Does it seem logical, or Maru?
Sounds fine to me.
Sorry, repeat that last bit.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that we would have some items which Huawei is more interested in doing in short term, long term, or I mean, far long term. We also don't have a clear vision, anyways. You would also have, from Red Hat's perspective, what is important to you as of now, at least for 6 months or forthcoming 6 to 8 months kind of stuff. I don't know about long term if you have clear vision of what's gonna be for our 1 year roadmap, but both of these items we can jot down and probably sit together one day to merge and reprioritize or prioritize whatever, and that could be our roadmap for Federation, right?
Yeah. I think I'm a little bit fuzzy on like going out a year because I don't know that I'd
Yeah,
want
I'm also not mentioning a
my
year.
use,
I
but-
also
But at the same time, and
Yeah.
we do have, as Quentin mentioned, there's a big spreadsheet of stuff that
Hmm.
we proposed to work on before, and I think it'll be interesting to go through that again and see what's still relevant, and maybe that'll pad out like the timeline to a year. In my head, I can't think of anything that would take that long, but it'll be a useful process anyway.
Okay. So, do we want to set aside some day for this, or probably the next or forthcoming Federation workgroup meeting? Maybe not tomorrow's, maybe next week's.
Do you think we can do this offline?
Yeah, I feel once we get to the next point, which is essentially the multi-cluster update itself, I started putting together in slide form. I encourage all the stakeholders to look at it and comment on it. Maybe I can just open up the edit access and you can use that to update, at least in a coarse grain form, what it is our roadmap would look like. That way we hit two birds with one stone.
Okay, seems logical. Let's move ahead. So, do you want to do an online review kind of a thing for that? That's what you're suggesting, Christian, or
Yeah, that's right.
then maybe you can go ahead and present that. Share the screen.
Just to be clear, are we talking about the slide deck linked in the notes here?
Yeah,
That's right.
Okay.
Pop it open.
Give me a
Yeah,
second.
I just put edit access to the whole SIG right now, so you can just go in and edit it. Some of the slides are empty, like charter roadmap. I didn't know what we wanted to do with charter, but some of those I filled in based on what has been going on over the last 6 months in the SIG. So feel free to jump in for edits. Maru already commented in some areas. But this would be the update portion of the presentation to the SIG at KubeCon. And then towards the end, we have this deep dive session. And for those who weren't present last week, the deep dive, we said we were going to go into demos, probably reiterate in the introduction a little bit what the SIG's about in short form. Haven't done that yet in the slides. But then 3 demos. We had I think Lindsay volunteered for the V2 prototype, and Irfan was saying something about cross-cluster services. So, I mean, we don't have to go through the entire deck here. If you make significant edits, I'd ask that you please leave a comment so that we know that there's a significant edit. If you just have a comment, feel free to comment.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for putting that together, Christian. I think that's super useful. Save everyone a lot of trouble. Yeah, we can sign up to basically get the federation part of that in shape, I think, for this week. And then we can just send a link to this to the PM guys and say this is where our roadmap is, slide number so and so. I think that works well.
Great. Save everybody another meeting.
Cool.
And I guess there, maybe it's worth just having a quick look at who's doing multi-cluster related things at KubeCon Europe in a few weeks' time. I know Irfan and I and others have about 3 or 4 talks that were accepted. I don't know if anyone else has talks that have been accepted to KubeCon related to any of the work here.
We're going to have Lindsay attending, and I think she's going to do a demo of Federation V2.
Oh, this is at the SIG work group, so that no independent presentations of anything.
I don't believe so, no.
There's Nikhil and I have a talk for CubeMCI.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. The meeting we had last Friday, Quentin, that you missed, I think the SIG presence there is from Google, myself, Greg, and Nikhil, Lindsay from Red Hat, and Irfan said that he'd be there with you.
Yes, cool. We can drink some beer.
Sounds good.
Cool. So I don't have anything else on the agenda for today. We want to use the remaining time for some other discussion? Yes.
I had one
Hello?
thing on the agenda.
Yep.
I wanted to have a quick discussion about the cluster registry API.
Okay.
Give an update to SIG, and then I was hoping that Paul would be here since he has been we've been in the deepest discussions with him, and he has some of the strongest opinions about this. But regardless, at the very least, I can present the issue to SIG. Can you see the presentation on my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So the main issue now that we are addressing with the cluster registry API before we attempt to move it to beta is to determine at what scope the cluster object should live. Essentially, we have two scoping options with a third compromise option. You can have the cluster object not be at a namespace scope. In Kubernetes terminology, this would be cluster scoped, but I think somebody else, it might have been Madhu, pointed out that technically, for this context, we can think of it not so much as a cluster scope, but as a global scope. That is a scope that is outside of a namespace and is not divided and constrained into namespaces. We can have the clusters at a namespace scope. In that case, the clusters would live in a namespace like config maps and other Kubernetes objects. The alternative is that we can have both of these. We can have one object which is cluster scoped and one object which is namespace scoped. This would be otherwise exactly the same object, simply with the difference that one has a namespace field that is set and the other one does not accept the namespace field. Lack of consensus on this is blocking moving us to beta. This is something that we want to actually decide before we move the API to beta, since it would be a rather large change to make after the fact, especially if we needed to move one to the other. That would be a non-compatible change. One point that comes into this discussion is the idea of standalone versus aggregated in the cluster registry. So the current cluster registry can be deployed either as a standalone API server, a Kubernetes style API server that just presents a cluster API and is not at all connected to a cluster's API server, or in an aggregated mode in which the cluster registry API server is run and is aggregated to the main cluster API server. In standalone mode, you can only access clusters at this endpoint. In aggregated mode, you can access clusters along with the other Kubernetes APIs at this endpoint. The scare quotes here are because as the cluster registry moves to a custom resource definition instead of an API server, it will not technically be an aggregated API, but it will be a custom API that is installed either into a Kubernetes cluster API server, which is analogous to aggregated mode, or that will be installed into a hypercube binary that is running independently, likely as a pod in the cluster, in which case it will be running in a standalone mode. This is important because when the cluster registry is standalone, the concept of namespaces has less mixing with the concept of cluster namespaces in a regular Kubernetes cluster than when the cluster registry is aggregated. So when you install a cluster CRD into a Kubernetes cluster that has existing objects, the concept of namespacing becomes a bit more complicated, and it becomes a bit confusing and more difficult to manage. So non-namespaced is the current model of how the cluster registry cluster object is scoped. This mimics what Federation v1 did with clusters. I think one of the main benefits of this, and this is sort of a summarized list rather than potentially all the deep details, is that it avoids the semantic confusion of namespaces, both in the standalone sense of not having to have multiple namespaces of clusters that cause clusters to get lost. And I think more importantly, in the aggregated sense, when you have namespaces that have meanings within the cluster, also now have meanings within the cluster registry, and the semantic confusion between those two different concepts that are merged into one I think has the potential to be quite high and to cause problems. One of the main problems with non-namespace scoped, and what sort of led us to consider namespacing originally, was that you can't authorize users to access a subset of clusters in a non-namespace cluster registry very easily. You can tell them they can read-write all the clusters, or they can read-write none of the clusters. This is the way to mitigate this is to run multiple independent instances of the cluster registry, independent API servers, which each have their own authorization rules. Namespaced. So namespacing is a much more common pattern for Kubernetes objects. Most of Kubernetes objects are namespaced. The Kubernetes guidance for objects says that it recommends to use a namespaced object unless there is a compelling reason not to. So it is the default. It allows fine-grained permissions on subsets of clusters. Another benefit is that it supports multi-tenant Kubernetes platforms as a service more natively. So if you are, in essence, if you are running a Kubernetes as a platform as a service and are distributing namespaces to customers, it's much easier to integrate a namespace cluster object into your deployment model than it would be if the object is cluster scoped. Unfortunately, some of the negatives that come of this, federating namespaces or namespace objects requires, or at least heavily suggests, the introduction of a nested namespace concept in aggregated mode, which is something that Kubernetes does not currently support. Do you imagine, for example, you have a namespace cluster registry, lives in a cluster, and now you want to federate some namespace into clusters. Well, how do you define what namespace is federated and how that namespace should be federated, which clusters it should be federated to when those clusters also live in namespaces? At the very least, this ends up being confusing. I think that it also has the potential to create some almost impossible to implement scenarios that would be relatively straightforward to implement if the cluster object were not a namespace scope, but were globally scoped.
Can I ask about this? So are you going to be propagating cluster objects into those federated clusters? I feel like cluster objects are in one central cluster.
I think my expectation would be that you would not propagate cluster objects into the underlying clusters. But I don't necessarily know. There's nothing that prevents that from happening given the model. But I don't think that will happen because that has the expectation that the underlying clusters themselves have a cluster registry object enabled, and I think just the semantics of that seem odd to me, that you would sync information about other clusters down to each of those clusters. So I
I-
think that'll be
So regarding federation of namespaces, my experience prototyping like V2 is that there's like having a federated namespace and a namespace resource just adds a tremendous amount of confusion. Like it was confusing for me as a developer, and I think it would be very hard to communicate to users. So that was the first point, is that, I mean, Federation V2, a namespace is a namespace is a namespace. The way that you define whether it's propagated or not is whether its contents are propagated or whether it has an explicit placement resource, but there's no such thing as a federated namespace. It's simply like a logical construct. And the second point was the way that V2 is sort of designed, you don't just take an arbitrary object and federate it. You have to define a template in order to sort of have basis for doing that. So if you have a resource of any kind, you'd have to create like a template in order to actually federate it. You couldn't just take the resource itself and use that, like, which is the divergence from V1. But in the case of this, I mean, currently we don't have any conception of federating non-namespace resources. I'm not saying we won't get there, but we're definitely not there today. Sorry, that's just my clarification.
Oh no, thank you, Maru. That does make sense.
So whether an object becomes namespaced or not is in underlying clusters is essentially deferred to the placement resource.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite understand.
I'm trying to parse what you just said. It seems that the determination of whether in this case, the cluster object gets federated or not, and obtains a namespace in the underlying clusters depends on the definition of the placement resource that's associated to it.
At present, in order for any resource to be federated, it has to be in a namespace. I haven't really gone as far as considering like what it would take to federate a non-namespace resource, and presumably it would revolve around placement. Like you would define a template and that wouldn't be namespaced, and you define placement and that wouldn't be namespaced, and then that would.
Is the federation architecture going to be? Okay, forget it. Sorry.
So I'm not saying it can't support it. I'm just saying I haven't really gone that far because workloads are generally namespaced. But when it comes to like non-namespace stuff, like RBAC, like if you want to be able to federate RBAC, then we'll have to explore that.
So when you propagate it to the targeted cluster, it's in the same namespace as it was initially?
There's essentially a one-to-one mapping. There's no like, oh, I have this like layout in my federation API and I'm going to have a different layout in the underlying cluster. You could do that, and that might have power in some circumstances, but it also could get super complicated, and we're just trying to keep it as simple as possible for now.
Sounds good.
Right. There's some of these resources, and unfortunately, I think cluster falls in there where they're just kind of meta resources, and we might find a way to like figure out how we want to do placement of them, but it's really not clear to me that we would want to put that resource in underlying clusters. Just like you wouldn't want to put a node resource, which is cluster scope, inside. So a node resource that exists at the same level of a cluster resource in sort of the meta control plane, you would not want to federate that into an underlying cluster.
I was about to make a similar comment, Christian. I think we might be going off into the weeds a little bit here, worrying about how to federate clusters. I think the more common use case for clusters is just having a registry of them so that we know what the possible places are to federate other things to. But what I am a little concerned about is the fact that, if I understand Jonathan correctly, we've kind of hit an impasse here where we can't make a decision. And that makes me worried. Is there any compromise we can make just to make a decision so we can actually move forward and then expand, like for example, only provide namespaced ones for now and then expand it to non-namespaced ones later, or vice versa, just so that we can actually continue to make forward progress rather than being stuck?
I think it's a pretty simple thing to to change now. Because I mean, really, it's like, am I using a resource for the client's namespace or not? It's more like for longer term, if I'm a user and I have a certain pattern of interaction that I'm used to, and suddenly it's different. I think like as much as to me, I think it makes sense to just namespace it by default, put it into the system namespace, and just be done with it. And that just allows a lot more flexibility. It's kind of a little bit hokey the way that namespaces work at the client level, because it's like having a default namespace, like I think that can confuse and trip up a lot of people, but that's kind of just the nature of how Kube namespaces work. If you don't understand that, you have a default namespace when you're performing operations, you're kind of hosed anyway.
That makes sense. I think the thing that really makes me lean away from namespaces is the fact that namespaces, the concept of namespaces in a cluster registry API and the concept of namespaces in a Kubernetes cluster API are mechanically exactly the same, but are conceptually different. So you imagine I have a Kubernetes cluster that has a namespace cluster object, and I have 3 namespaces for my 3 different regions that my clusters live in. Well, what do those namespaces don't have any meaning in the cluster themselves, and yet it is now possible to install workloads into these resources and have things in these resources that don't have real meaning within the cluster itself, because the cluster is not necessarily within that region. The cluster is in a particular zone within that region, potentially. This seems like a very confusing mismatch to me. And I think that was the second negative that I had suggested here for namespace. Quinton, you had mentioned, is there a compromise? So in essence, the compromise solution we had thought about was that we just have both versions of the API right out the gate. The plus of this is that it requires us to not actually make a decision right now. I dislike this, I think, more than the other options, because it has a lot of negatives, in my opinion. It opens the door for the APIs to diverge. The fact that we now have 2 differently scoped versions of the same API means that we've overcome the initial step of breaking into 2 separate things that now have the potential to evolve in different directions, unless somebody is very vigilant to keep them the same.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure I agree that just having 2 versions offers like the possibility of divergence, because I mean, they could be pointing at the same thing, right?
So I think that you can have them technically be pointing at the same thing right now, but we've set a precedent that in case of a decision where we can't agree, we fork. And that makes it very easy later on to look back and say, oh yeah, we can't come to agreement on this. This group of people want to do this, so we fork. I think it's
hold on though. I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about like, the spec and the status. So I just don't see why those couldn't be shared in common. And yeah, you would have the outer type have all the code generation for a namespace that I'm not namespaced, and you generate 2 different things, but the actual implementation would be shared. And I think that would forestall the possibility of divergence.
I personally disagree, but I think this is something that we can't know.
I guess, why do you think that divergence will be possible if you can define the same internals for both of them once? How is it going to change independently?
I think the thing that's keeping this from diverging is not the technical fact that there is one shared implementation. It is the high-level fact that we actually have one implementation, and that there's a substantial barrier and burden on somebody to say, I want to go and do this other thing and make it be sort of an approved model. Whereas in essence now, if we agree to do both, we've sanctioned this fork. And now somebody can take one or the other, move it in a different direction, and has an easier time moving that and bringing the burden of community behind them by being able to point back to the previous decision to fork. I think it makes it politically easier to continue to diverge the APIs than it is if there is one version of the API.
I don't have a strong opinion either way, but what I can tell you is that I think not making progress and not releasing a beta API is worse than any of the bad outcomes that I've heard for the alternatives. So my suggestion would be to pick one of the three alternatives that you have on the table right now. And you could do that with a simple vote or something, and accept that not everybody is going to vote for the same alternative, but that's better than not going forward at this point. That's my advice. I'm not.
So I think Kubernetes overall, though, has always been focused on making sure we make the right decision going forward, especially at beta, because once things are in beta, we're locked in, and the worst thing that we want to do is end up with an API that is, you know, unchangeable in the future. And I've seen time and time again in other SIGs, the SIGs taking the effort to make sure that we're doing the right thing and not the fast thing. And it feels like here, you know, that this doesn't, you know, we don't want to be in a rush to do something that's important.
Yeah, I guess what I'm leaning, what I'm picking up, and I might be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it seems we've hit an impasse here. So it doesn't matter how much longer we wait, we're never going to come to agreement that one of these three options is the best.
No, I don't think we have an impasse. I think what we just need to do is like do what we've done in the past before, is take the time, focus on it in a more, you know, just have a session in a more focused way to hit this. I know that Tim feels very strongly about this decision too. And I think that, you know, he said he's willing next week.
Tim Hawken? Sorry,
Yeah.
which Tim? Okay.
Right, Tim Hawken also, he feels strongly about this also. So we can, you know, I think what we need to do for this is we have all these out-of-band federation meetings, and I think that they're wonderful and that they're allowing for focus and expertise. It looks like we should have just one out-of-band cluster registry meeting where we discuss this and other items. And we then are able to illustrate the problems that we're trying to solve. And the last time I heard about this, the real issue was making sure that it was compatible and that OpenShift had a feasible solution to working towards it. When I think, Paul, are you on the line?
No, Paul.
So when I talked to Paul about this, and I may be misrepresenting it, which is why I think we need to make sure that we have a meeting where Paul, Tim, and the people working on the cluster registry are together. The question he had, as I understood it, wasn't that namespacing was the right thing to do as much as he felt boxed in a little bit by OpenShift implementation. So I think that we need to make sure that we're doing what's right and simple for the users, and then on top of that, finding what we can do to make this work with OpenShift. And I think those are almost like two separate questions, and that should be our focus. I think it is doable. I don't think it's impossible, and I don't think it's an impasse. I've never seen an impasse in Kubernetes. I think that we all work together and try to come up with the right decision. And since the project's early started, that has been one of the guiding lights and principles of what we do. And so to sort of say, it's too hard to work through it, to me, feels like we're taking a step back of what makes Kubernetes great. So maybe we should schedule that out-of-band cluster registry meeting, make sure that the right folks are there, and then the great thing is we should have something hopefully in time for KubeCon to present. Christian, does that sound okay to you?
Sounds fine to me. I mean, I think the source of what we're calling the impasse for me is that I can't quite see the use cases where the namespace actually solves an issue. And every time I try to think about it even more, like I'm thinking about the user, where suddenly this object winds up in a Helm chart, it gets deployed at a certain namespace, and the model is all completely incompatible with what we've known has worked before, which is the Federation V1 model of having it be cluster scope. So really, you know, in preparation for that meeting, if everybody could just kind of focus on their use case, and bring that to the table, I think that would be the most useful.
And I think it'd be good too if we can figure out who the owners, the stakeholders, and the opinion holders are, so we know exactly what the impact to it is, and that'll also help us know who needs to be there. Yeah. But the last I remember hearing about it isn't that there's that we think the users will be better served by a namespace. I believe the idea was we have all this legacy machinery around, and then how do we make it work with that machinery? Right. And to me, that isn't enough of a justification to do something where we want to make users' lives easier. So the question to me is that this is my belief, which is why I think we need this time, is set up what we think is going to be best for the user, and then figure out whatever adapters that we need for the legacy space.
Right. And this is where I think the vote fails. And for example, I'll give that as an example. I'll say we left this out to community as a question. Everybody started chiming in, including a lot of people who had no context about what cluster registry was. And by far, the opinion was, well, everything else is namespaced, so what's the issue? Just throw a namespace on it, which, you know, if that goes to a vote, of course, we end up putting a namespace, and we're not sure that's the right answer.
So I think there needs to be context and background in this. I actually thought myself, a lot of this is from my own ideas and in ignorance, where when this question first came up, I said, oh, namespace, everything is good. That helps us because I get so involved in multi-tenancy right now. And then I learned more about the problem we're trying to solve and the shortcomings of doing it that way. And so I think that, you know, at this point, I remember Tim in the morning, I was talking to him and he was also feeling the same way. He's like, we got a namespace. And then he also learned more about the problem, you know, the context. And then he came back to me and said, oh, Mike, I'm sorry. So every time we've broken it down to people so far, we've come to that conclusion. And I believe Paul may be in that camp too, but maybe constrained by the machinery of OpenShift. So let's try to do what's great for the user. And then let's try to figure out, you know, how we then make this work in our ecosystem as two separate pieces. And I think we can do both. So I think having impasses.
I think that having a discussion offline is imperative. My take on Paul's sort of slant is a little bit different than yours. And that is that what we're really lacking here is filtered list and watch. And so maybe we're in a multi-tenancy scenario where some clusters we want to have visible to some users and not others. And namespacing today is the only way to accomplish that. If we have a global cluster resource, then we just, at least people who have direct access to the API, there's no way to have that be selective. I was thinking though that maybe we solve that by simply requiring a client like a front end that can be selective. In which case you know, anybody who wants just global cluster resource and everybody can see everything gets what they want. And then you have a secondary filtering thing in front of that for users that require that sort of thing. But Paul would have to chime in. I haven't discussed that specifically with him, but at least I think, does that give you some insight into one of the use cases we have here?
It does, but I also think that, I think it needs what we just been talking about. I think we need an offline session where we can really work through these problems. I think we can work through them. I don't think that, I think we're only just at an impasse because we haven't done the work. And I think we have both the time, the inclination, and the priority to do so. And I think a strict vote also doesn't seem to make sense to me because I don't believe that the information is widely understood. And so that's kind of like, I don't know if you guys know about this, but in California, we have all these propositions that begin with like, do you vote to not do the negative of the other thing? And I never understand exactly what's all the details are. And so I feel like this one's also, the more I learn about it, the more I understand. And also I want to hear what Maru has to say.
You vote by the prettiest lawn sign.
I don't think a vote is in any way useful. I mean, you need stakeholders involved with all the use cases on the table, and then you have to figure out a compromise that works for most people. So.
All right, so it sounds like we're in agreement that we need to have follow-up later with a meeting. We can take an action item to set up that meeting with people. If anyone is particularly interested, please let us know. I don't think we'll send out the invite to the entire SIG in an attempt to keep it focused. But.
And I should say, I don't really think that this taking a little bit longer is a problem. Like, it's not blocking Federation v2. We'll use whatever we have to use. It's a pretty minor integration surface. So.
Cool.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left. Did anybody have anything else they wanted to bring up before we get 8 minutes back? Going once, twice, gone. All right, have a good week, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.